Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the absolute underdog survival story of one of America's most famous financial institutions. Today, you see the Wells Fargo name plastered on skyscrapers and literally millions of credit cards, right? But their origin story, it is way grittier than you might think. So, how exactly did this tiny mail delivery startup survive stagecoach robbers, totally brutal deserts, and a catastrophic economic crash to become a modern banking empire? Well, to figure that out, we kind of have to travel back in time. We have to look at the brutal landscape and economy of the 1850s, almost like a ruthless movie villain that had to be defeated. Because back then, it wasn't just about building a business, it was about sheer, unyielding survival on a completely unforgiving frontier.
Section 1. The West's Communication Crisis.
Okay, so the 1848 gold rush happens, and it creates this desperate, immediate need for secure transport and communication, as hundreds of thousands of fortune seekers just flooded out west. But picture this. At the time, if you wanted to deliver money or send a message, you literally walked down to a dock, handed your valuables to a total stranger on a stagecoach or a steamship, and just hoped for the best. Good luck. Obviously, for people trying to build a new life or start a business out west, that total lack of security was a nightmare. It was completely unsustainable. They desperately needed a lifeline back east.
Section 2. Forging Wells Fargo & Co. Now look at this incredible contrast between our two founders. On the left, you've got Henry Wells. This guy actually overcame a severe stutter to teach speech therapy to others, and he eventually became this highly outgoing, visionary pioneer in express delivery. Then, on the right, William G. Fargo. He started carrying mail when he was just 13 years old on a brutal 43-mile circuit, and he later grew up to be a powerful railroad magnate and even a two-term Civil War-era mayor of Buffalo. So we're talking about two incredibly resilient, determined guys who absolutely knew how to push through massive adversity. And here's how their paths actually collided. In 1850, they joined forces to form the American Express Company. Yeah, that American Express, focusing mostly on the East Coast. But as this massive migration to California started booming, they were like, we need to expand to the Pacific market. Surprisingly, though, the American Express board flatly refused. They basically said, no way, it's way too risky. But Henry and William, they didn't just take no for an answer. They defied their own board, stepped out on their own, and boldly started a competing business in March 1852. They created Wells Fargo & Co. specifically to solve that communication crisis out west. Talk about taking a huge risk to chase a monumental opportunity. Section 3. Surviving the 1855 Panic. To really get a sense of how much of a tiny underdog Wells Fargo was at first, check out this November 1854 steamship gold manifest. Just compare the value of their gold shipments against the massive entrenched giants of the time. Page, Bacon & Company, they shipped over $417,000 in gold. Adams Express shipped an equally impressive $350,000. And Wells Fargo? They were trailing far, far behind at just $177,000. They were literally just a small fish in a chaotic pond, fighting for scraps in a fiercely competitive market. But here is where things get crazy. In 1854, a severe drought hit California, which made gold placer mining virtually impossible. Without water to wash the dirt, the miners simply couldn't work. As a result, debts went unpaid, and by late 1854, local real estate prices just plummeted. The whole economy was teetering on a knife's edge. And then, in February 1855, absolute panic. A leading bank's parent company failed back east, which triggered massive bank runs in California. This economic contagion spread like wildfire and completely wiped out nearly 200 businesses, including those huge wealthy competitors we were just talking about. The big guys just went belly up. But while hundreds of businesses were failing all around them, Wells Fargo did something pretty remarkable. Instead of locking their doors, they proactively paid out their panicked depositors. They relied on a firm foundation of conservative banking and just sheer unwavering honesty. Look at this quote from a Wells Fargo branch clerk in Auburn. He said, "Most of the money on general deposit was placed here by my friends who believe I am an honest man." It's fascinating, right? It eerily parallels how resilient banks survived the 2008 financial crisis. They steered clear of wild speculation and focused on absolute trust, transparency, and conservative cash reserves, while everyone else was gambling. Section 4. Conquering the overland mail. So in 1857, acting as the primary lender and banker, Wells Fargo helped organize the Overland Mail Company, and this group secured an absolutely massive $600,000 a year federal contract to move the United States mail. Just to put that into perspective, this was the largest land mail contract ever awarded in U.S. history at the time. It was a huge influx of cash, for sure, but it came with demands that seemed virtually impossible to meet. To actually earn that money, they faced a logistical nightmare spanning 2,800 brutal miles. They had to build roughly 150 relay stations completely from scratch and hire 800 rugged employees, all to cover this grueling oxbow route that swung far south from St. Louis all the way across to San Francisco. And to make matters even worse, the government strictly required them to make the entire journey in just 25 days. That meant traveling 24 hours a day through blistering heat and freezing nights without ever stopping. This was a bone-rattling, non-stop journey through deeply hostile terrain. Waterman L. Ormsby, who was actually a reporter and the very first westbound through passenger on this route, summed it up perfectly. He said, "Had I not just come out over the route, I would be perfectly willing to go back. But I know what hell is like. I've just had 24 days of it." And honestly, he wasn't exaggerating. It was a perilous trek plagued by a desperate lack of water, treacherous roads, and constant physical danger. Yet, somehow, the Wells Fargo network kept those stages moving. What's even more impressive, though, is how they navigated the massive legal hurdles. So at the time, the U.S. Post Office held a strict statutory monopoly on mail delivery. Private competitors were legally shut out. So what did Wells Fargo do? They outsmarted them with a brilliant loophole. They simply bought government envelopes in bulk by the thousands, printed their own distinct Wells Fargo frank on the front, and ran the private express routes themselves. Essentially, they paid the post office its postage fee even when the government never actually touched the mail. This allowed Wells Fargo to legally dominate the faster private express market without breaking federal law. Just genius. And they never stopped adapting to their crazy environment. In 1862, torrential rains completely washed out the trails, turning the roads into totally impassable mud. The heavy stagecoaches literally couldn't make the vital trip between the booming Nevada mining camps and California. So they pivoted again with the Virginia City Pony Express. Using agile riders, tough ponies, and this distinct 10-cent brown stamp, they just bypassed the mud entirely and rapidly moved critical business mail right over the mountains, keeping commerce alive. And because that express service was so vital and wildly efficient for urgent business matters, they quickly realized its immense value. By January 1863, they actually raised the rate to 25 cents per half ounce, which you can see marked by this new red stamp. This was a strategic move that completely solidified their financial dominance and profitability in Western logistics. It really proved that speed and absolute reliability command a premium, even in the middle of a literal wilderness.
Section 5. The end of an era.
Of course, all eras come to an end. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 permanently replaced the mighty stagecoaches for long-distance travel. The age of oxen and stage horses gave way to steam and steel almost overnight. On top of that, the U.S. Post Office eventually started offering significantly lower rates, which inevitably caused Wells Fargo to discontinue its famous mail service. This massive technological and market shift forced them to rely entirely on that conservative financial foundation they built way back during the Panic of 1855. They basically pivoted the company firmly and permanently into banking and financial services.
Which leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to wrap up our explainer today. Think about it. How much of that gritty, stagecoach driving survival instinct, forged in brutal deserts, treacherous mud, and crushing economic panics, is still hardwired into the DNA of today's massive financial institutions? It is pretty incredible to think that the exact same bedrock conservative principles that paid out panicking miners in 1855 are the very same principles that guide modern banking resilience in the digital age. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I really hope this dive into the past gave you a brand new perspective on a very familiar name.